Greetings collectors and welcome to today's retro game review. You join us at the start of the Sega Saturn Capcom Fighting miniseries. No matter your age or platform of choice, I think we can all agree that Capcom have produced some outstanding fighting games over the years. The problem is that the Capcom 2D fighter universe is not just a single series, it's a whole history of overlapping crossovers, cameos, remakes, nonsensical additions, same games by a different name, and regional exclusives. I had looked at making an end-to-end Street Fighter mini-series covering all of the games to date, but when I saw just how many games, editions and formats there are, I just couldn't imagine that there's enough space on the YouTube servers to handle it all. Instead, I'd like to take you on a more manageable journey of the 2D Capcom fighter games officially released for the Sega Saturn. So, here are the rules of the series. I'll be looking at all sequential, non-spin-off titles released on the system. That means no Puzzle Fighter or the anime movie game. The series won't cover the other Capcom 32-bit series, such as the Street Fighter EX series. To keep things simple, I'll also largely be keeping to the Japanese editions of the games. North America and Europe also received most of the same games on this list, although often under different names. Most notably, the Street Fighter Zero series became Street Fighter Alpha outside of Japan. This means we're also going to have some great fun when it comes to the naming conventions of characters, particularly in the Street Fighter series. Those of you that collect Japanese Street Fighter games will already know this, but for my Western audience, here are some quick explanations. In Japan, M. Bison is known as Vega. Vega is known as Balrog. And Balrog is known as M. Bison. In Japan, Akuma is also known as Goki. Evil Ryu occasionally translates to something closer to Dark Ryu, depending on the source material. In short, the Street Fighter reviews in this series are almost certainly going to generate comments of why the names are all over the place. Welcome to Capcom. In this episode, I'd just like to take the time to explain the chronology of the Sega Saturn library. I'll be featuring the Street Fighter series, the Street Fighter crossover series, the Marvel series, as well as the Darkstalker series, known as the Vampire series in Japan. If you're a modern gamer looking back at Capcom's back catalogue, it can be difficult to understand how each series evolved and how interlinked they are. As such, I'd like to share the context of the timeline and if it's worth your while collecting these games today. Whilst it was the 16-bit era that was the true origin of many of these series, I personally found that it was the 32-bit era that really shaped how the series would look in the years to come. So, first up on the timeline, Street Fighter, the movie. This game had the unenviable task of ushering Street Fighter onto the Sega Saturn platform. Not only is the presentation unconventional, but it also has the distinction of being based on a movie of the same name, based on the game. And here is that movie, the 1994 Jean-Claude Van Damme Raul Julia romp that left us slightly baffled as to why Ryu and Ken were con artists, Blanca looks like the Elephant Man's green cousin, and why Julia never won the Oscar for the most insane acting as a movie villain ever. I have the DVD here, but more on this in another episode. Those 3.8 stars on IMDb can wait. It was 1995, the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn fans looked forward to a new Street Fighter game for the next generation. What we received didn't go down too well. The movie source material had taken a few liberties with the Street Fighter universe and was panned by critics. For what it's worth, I find the movie a bit of a rather satisfying disaster. It's fun for all the wrong reasons. How would it translate to the 32-bit platform though as a game? In short, not well. Street Fighter 2, Turbo editions and Championship editions had all dominated the arcade and found their way into our home collections. The decision to change the presentation style was perhaps the first issue. Compared to the more cartoon-like classic Street Fighter, the game suffers twofold. Firstly, the digitised sprites look very jagged in places. They also seem to have very few frames of animation. It just makes the game feel very cheap. The sprites appear washed out, and even the background animations have very limited frame rates. We had already seen gaming rivals, such as Mortal Kombat, get this right on the 16-bit consoles, so why the execution was so below par here remains a mystery. Secondly comes the issue of the sprites themselves. We're so used to seeing the characters in a certain way, any change is likely to be met with suspicion. Just look at Blanka for example. Compared to his classic appearance, there's few that will prefer the movie incarnation.
Round 1, fight!
The game adaptation did allow Capcom to experiment with the story mode. Playing as Guile, you follow the cutscenes and decide on a route to take on your way to defeat Bison. It's a good idea in principle, but having established that it's not really a plot that drives Street Fighter, it's not a huge bonus for the game. There is of course the classic Street Fight mode that plays very much as you would expect a Street Fighter game. Select your character and then come up against a rather well fleshed out roster of fighters. This is where things get noticeably bad. The game very much seems like the black sheep of the Street Fighter series. For some reason it just doesn't feel like a Street Fighter game. It's a bit unbalanced, the hitboxes are not quite where you think they ought to be, and overall this turns into a button masher rather than any reliance on fighting strategy. To be fair to the game, it isn't terrible. You can certainly find worse fighting games out there. The issue is that this isn't just any fighting game, this is Capcom's premier fighting series, and rightly or wrongly, it will always be measured by the other games that preceded it. So far, Capcom hadn't ushered in the 32-bit era of fighting games with any finesse, but that was about to change. Capcom's next release would see them team up with the Marvel license to re-establish themselves as the arcade fighting kings. Join me in the next episode where we take a fond look back at X-Men: Children of the Atom.
X-Men.